This story is based on real events documented in police files, revealing the hidden dangers of secrecy and desperation. At the heart of this case lies a tragic interaction between a wealthy woman and a young man, a fateful meeting that ended in a horrific crime. In a quiet suburb, 60-year-old Eleanor Hayes lived a reclusive life, appearing to neighbors as a private but gracious woman. However, Eleanor's life behind closed doors held secrets she never intended for the world to know. Chapter 2: Eleanor's Life. Eleanor Hayes was, by most outward appearances, a woman who had achieved the American dream. In her 60s, she lived alone in a large, elegantly decorated house in a quiet, affluent neighborhood. Her life seemed peaceful, but it had been touched by hardship and loss. Widowed in her early 50s, Eleanor had spent nearly a decade adapting to a life of solitude. Her late husband, Thomas, had been a well-respected attorney who provided her with a comfortable lifestyle. After his sudden passing, Eleanor was left to navigate her days alone in a house that felt emptier with each passing year. Friends and family members had faded into the background over time, leaving her with very few people she could truly rely on. Retirement had brought her some relief from the responsibilities of work, but also a sharp awareness of the isolation that had gradually overtaken her life. She was financially stable, with substantial savings and a sizable inheritance from her husband, but the independence she had once valued began to feel like a burden. Her routine days became filled with quiet tasks, reading, tending to her garden, and attending the occasional charity event. At her core, Eleanor was an intelligent and resilient woman. She had weathered difficult storms throughout her life and had learned to maintain an image of composure. She had never wanted to be pitied, nor did she want anyone to know how deeply the loneliness affected her. To her neighbors, Eleanor appeared dignified and content, someone who had gracefully adapted to her circumstances. She attended neighborhood gatherings when invited, exchanged polite conversation, and occasionally hosted small dinners. Her life looked orderly and elegant from the outside, and Eleanor was careful to protect that image. Yet, behind the closed doors of her home, Eleanor grappled with a deep and unfulfilled desire for human connection. She began to explore online forums and social media, initially as a casual observer. The digital world offered a sense of anonymity and freedom that her real life did not, allowing her to engage with others without exposing the parts of herself she kept hidden. Over time, Eleanor stumbled upon a community where older adults sought connections with younger individuals. It was here that Eleanor first entertained the idea of paying for companionship, an arrangement that seemed straightforward and manageable, providing her with the company she desired without the complications of a conventional relationship. As she became more comfortable navigating these online spaces, Eleanor began reaching out to younger men who seemed open to her offers. Her approach was discreet, careful to avoid attracting too much attention or judgment. She carefully chose men who appeared to be struggling financially, young men in their 20s who needed quick cash and might appreciate her company in exchange. For Eleanor, this arrangement was practical. It offered companionship and connection while allowing her to remain in control of her own life. She could set the terms, manage the boundaries, and maintain her independence, all while filling the emotional void that had grown over the years. In these private encounters, Eleanor was able to let down her guard, if only temporarily. The young men she met were strangers to her world and carried no preconceived notions of who she was supposed to be. She could share parts of herself she kept hidden from friends and neighbors, laughing freely and discussing topics she felt she could not explore elsewhere. The age difference allowed her to assume a position of authority, offering advice, financial assistance, and even life guidance. She found herself feeling younger, more vibrant, and more alive in their company, and in return, she offered them the material stability they sought. The arrangement became a subtle but addictive part of Eleanor's life. As the encounters continued, she found herself relying more and more on these meetings to break up the monotony of her routine. She would dress carefully, selecting outfits that accentuated her grace and sophistication. She prepared her home for each visit, lighting candles and arranging flowers in her living room. Each encounter was carefully planned and controlled, a ritual that allowed her to experience companionship without compromising her privacy or reputation. But despite her meticulous efforts to keep her private life hidden, Eleanor's arrangement carried risks. She knew very little about the young men she invited into her home, trusting that her financial support would ensure their discretion. She also chose to ignore the potential dangers, perhaps out of denial or out of a need so strong it overshadowed her caution. As the years went on, Eleanor became more comfortable, even complacent, believing that she could manage this double life without consequence. It was a fragile balance, but one she thought she could control. The truth, however, was that Eleanor's need for companionship had created a vulnerability she hadn't fully acknowledged. In her quest for human connection, she had inadvertently opened a door to individuals whose motivations were not always clear. Her arrangements grew riskier over time as her standards for choosing companions became less stringent, and she ignored red flags in favor of maintaining her carefully constructed world of fleeting intimacy. It was only a matter of time before her carefully guarded secret would unravel in a way she could never have anticipated. Eleanor's private world of companionship was unlike anything she had ever experienced. For years, she had navigated her life within strict boundaries, adhering to societal expectations and personal decorum. But behind the anonymity of a screen, in the quiet of her own home, Eleanor found a way to break free from these constraints. This secret life she had cultivated offered her a form of connection, one that came without the risk of gossip or the scrutiny of her neighbors. It was her own world, and she fiercely guarded it. She would start with browsing discreet, often obscure websites and forums, looking for profiles of young men in their 20s who seemed open to unconventional arrangements. Eleanor had developed a sense for these spaces, knowing where to look and how to approach the men without revealing too much about herself. She always kept her messages brief, polite, and respectful, offering money in exchange for their time and company. For Eleanor, this was a transaction, a straightforward exchange that allowed her to feel the warmth of another person, if only temporarily. The young men she chose were often from lower-income backgrounds, students or part-time workers seeking extra cash to make ends meet. Some had dreams of going back to school or starting businesses, others just needed to pay rent. They were often flattered by her attention, and the money she offered was usually a sum they couldn't refuse. Eleanor felt a strange satisfaction in being able to help them, providing something of value to people who seemed grateful for it. In exchange, they gave her a fleeting sense of youth and vitality, a reminder of a world she had left behind long ago. For Eleanor, the age difference between herself and her companions was not something she viewed with embarrassment, but rather as a testament to her independence and desirability. She found that these young men were respectful and appreciative of her maturity. Some even admired her life experience and wisdom. She would share stories from her past, describing her travels, her interests, and her views on life. These conversations allowed her to step out of her traditional role, feeling younger and more alive. In turn, she would listen to the stories of her companions, hearing about their struggles, ambitions, and challenges. They opened up to her in ways she found endearing, confiding details they might not share with people their own age. Yet as exhilarating as these private connections were, Eleanor remained vigilant, aware of the risks involved. She prided herself on maintaining control, both emotionally and financially. She would only see each person once or twice before moving on, preferring to keep things fresh and uncomplicated. Eleanor avoided deeper emotional ties, knowing that attachments would only complicate the arrangement. She viewed each encounter as a passing moment, a brief, carefully orchestrated meeting that ended as soon as they stepped out her door. However, as her need for companionship grew, Eleanor began to take greater risks. In the past, she had been meticulous about vetting her companions, ensuring she chose men who seemed reliable and safe. But over time, her standards slipped. She began responding to profiles she might have once dismissed, overlooking signs of instability in her desire to feel connected. This gradual erosion of her caution left her increasingly vulnerable, a fact she was unwilling to fully admit. One particular encounter would prove to be a turning point. Among the profiles she encountered, one young man, who went by the name Jason, caught her eye. At 22, James was younger than most of the men she'd met, yet he had a confidence and presence that instantly intrigued her. His profile was simple, a few photos, a brief bio mentioning his studies and need for extra income. There were none of the usual red flags she'd come to recognize, no air of desperation or brashness. Instead, James presented himself as intelligent, reserved, and self-assured, a young man who seemed both grounded and ambitious. After exchanging polite introductions online, Eleanor felt a spark of excitement. James was articulate, intelligent, and possessed a maturity that belied his age. He spoke of his dreams of one day starting his own business, of his struggles as a student from a modest background, and of his desire to make something of himself. Eleanor was drawn to his authenticity. He didn't seem to overplay his hardships or mask his goals with bravado. Their conversations quickly grew longer and deeper, evolving into a candid dialogue that left Eleanor feeling seen in a way she hadn't in years. Unlike the more transactional tone of her other encounters, Eleanor's conversations with James had a genuine warmth. In him, she sensed an intelligence and humor that felt new and refreshing. She felt her guardedness slipping away, allowing herself to indulge in the intrigue of their connection. Each time they spoke, she learned more about his life and dreams, his frustrations and uncertainties, and James listened with an attentiveness that made Eleanor feel valued. He seemed genuinely interested in her stories, asking questions that others hadn't. Eleanor couldn't help but be drawn to him, finding herself looking forward to each new message and the easy intimacy of their exchanges. After a few weeks of increasingly personal conversations, Eleanor suggested a face-to-face meeting. She framed it as she always did, keeping it discreet and transactional. Yet, this time felt different. She had begun to think of James not just as a companion, but as a confidant. Her invitation was carefully worded, and when he accepted, she felt a nervous anticipation she hadn't felt in years. She wanted to impress him, to show him a side of her that only a select few had ever seen. The night of their meeting, Eleanor meticulously prepared her home. She dimmed the lights to create a warm ambience, arranged flowers on the table, and dressed in a way that was elegant yet understated. Her home had always been her sanctuary, a place where she felt safe and in control, and she wanted to present it as such to James. James arrived on time, greeting her with a respectful politeness that put her at ease. He seemed slightly nervous, but his charm quickly broke through, and they settled into a conversation that felt natural and unforced. Eleanor offered him a drink, and they sat across from each other in her cozy living room, exchanging stories that quickly became more personal. She told him about her career, the life she had built, and hinted at the loneliness she'd felt after her marriage had ended. James listened with empathy, nodding and offering small comments that showed he was fully engaged in her story. As the evening went on, the atmosphere grew increasingly comfortable, with both of them loosening up, sharing laughs, and letting the natural connection between them flourish. James shared details about his own life, how he'd grown up in a working-class neighborhood, how he'd always dreamed of something bigger, and how he was constantly trying to balance work and studies to make ends meet. He spoke of his aspirations with a kind of honesty that Eleanor found endearing, and she felt a pang of sympathy for his struggles. What set James apart from her previous companions was his ability to make her feel understood and appreciated. He didn't just see her as an older woman or a wealthy patron, he treated her as an equal. Eleanor found herself letting down her guard, laughing easily, and sharing anecdotes she might have kept private. There was an undeniable warmth between them, a spark that felt both exciting and unsettling. She felt herself forgetting, if only briefly, the transactional nature of their relationship, losing herself in the shared connection they had begun to build. At some point in the evening, James shifted the conversation, his gaze growing more intense. He complimented Eleanor in a way that felt genuine, not like the flattery she had often received but with a subtle appreciation for her intelligence and strength. It was these small gestures, these simple words, that endeared him to her even more. In this young man, Eleanor saw a depth and sensitivity that she hadn't experienced in years, a reminder of what she had once longed for in her younger days. Though their arrangement was clear, Eleanor felt the boundaries blurring. She wondered if James felt it too. The connection between them was beginning to feel less like a transaction and more like an understanding, a mutual recognition of loneliness and ambition. That night, for the first time, Eleanor allowed herself to hope that this connection could last beyond a single meeting. She dared to imagine that perhaps James would come to value her for more than just the financial support she provided. But as the evening drew to a close, Eleanor sensed a subtle shift in James's demeanor. While he remained polite and engaged, there was a brief flicker of something else in his gaze, a flash of calculation, momentary distance that unsettled her. Eleanor brushed it off as fatigue, a small crack in the otherwise perfect evening. Yet, as he prepared to leave, he lingered near the door, his eyes wandering over her home. He remarked casually about the beauty of her possessions, the elegance of her decor, and even hinted at the wealth she must have accumulated. Eleanor felt a faint unease, but his charm quickly disarmed her, and she dismissed her concerns as paranoia. That night, after James left, Eleanor couldn't help but feel a lingering sense of excitement mixed with apprehension. She replayed their conversation in her mind, savoring the warmth and intimacy they had shared. But beneath her excitement, a faint sense of doubt lingered, a small voice reminding her of the risks she was taking. She knew that inviting people into her private world came with consequences, yet she chose to ignore that inner warning, too entranced by the thrill of their connection. What Eleanor didn't know was that this meeting marked the beginning of a dangerous path. James had seen beyond her carefully curated facade, glimpsing the vulnerability beneath her wealth and confidence. He had noted her trust, her openness, and her solitude. While Eleanor had viewed their meeting as a hopeful encounter, a rare chance at companionship, James had seen an opportunity, a way to turn her wealth and vulnerability to his advantage. In the days that followed, Eleanor waited eagerly for a message from James, hoping he would reach out and perhaps suggest another meeting. Little did she know, James was planning his next move, weighing the opportunity that lay before him. To him, Eleanor was more than just a benefactor, she was a target, a person who had opened her door and her life to him without fully understanding who he truly was. Eleanor had been too captivated by the connection she felt to notice the warning signs, too caught up in her own feelings of rediscovery to see the danger lurking beneath James's charming exterior. As the days passed, her life returned to its routine, yet she found herself distracted, thinking of him and the fleeting warmth they had shared. It was only a matter of time before their paths would cross again, leading her further down a path from which she would not return. Eleanor had been eager to see James again after their first meeting. Their conversations had lingered in her mind, replaying his thoughtful words and gentle compliments, filling her with a thrill she hadn't felt in years. She'd hoped their connection would blossom further, offering her companionship beyond the emptiness of her hidden world. But when James finally reached out, the tone of his message felt different, brief, almost curt. He suggested meeting at her home, emphasizing that it would be better to avoid any public settings. Though Eleanor found his directness slightly unsettling, she was willing to overlook it, her desire to see him again overriding her initial apprehensions. The night of their second meeting arrived, and Eleanor meticulously prepared her home, just as she had done the first time. When James finally arrived, Eleanor noticed a change in his demeanor almost immediately. His polite warmth had been replaced with a certain restlessness, his gaze darting around her home in a way that felt more inquisitive than admiring. As she welcomed him in, offering him a drink, she felt the weight of his gaze linger on her belongings, the fine art on her walls, the luxurious furnishings, and the subtle touches of wealth and comfort that filled every room. Eleanor's unease deepened, but she maintained her composure, hoping that conversation would ease the strange tension that had settled between them. The evening started awkwardly, with Eleanor trying to revive the warmth they'd shared during their previous encounter. She asked about his studies, his family, and his dreams, hoping to see the spark in him that had drawn her in. But James's responses were clipped and evasive, his answers lacking the openness he had shown before. His attention seemed divided, as if he was waiting for something or distracted by some inner conflict. Eleanor noticed that he glanced frequently at his phone, and she couldn't shake the feeling that he was simply going through the motions, his mind elsewhere. After a brief lull in conversation, James's demeanor changed yet again, this time adopting a calculated, almost predatory calm. She glanced toward her phone, considering the possibility of sending a quick message to a friend or even calling the police, but dismissed the idea as an overreaction, telling herself she was being paranoid. When James casually mentioned needing to use the bathroom, Eleanor nodded, hoping a brief pause might restore some normalcy to their evening. But instead of heading down the hallway, James slipped into her bedroom. Eleanor, taken aback, called out to him, her voice carrying a hint of alarm. James reappeared almost instantly, his expression unreadable. He'd clearly seen enough of her room to confirm what he might have suspected: her jewelry box, her designer handbags, and the other valuables scattered throughout her home. Her heart began to race as James approached her again, his once familiar face now carrying an air of cold detachment. Before Eleanor could speak, he began to ask probing questions, his voice calm but laced with a menacing undertone. He asked her about her finances, her valuables, and even the security of her home, as if challenging her trust and daring her to confront him. Eleanor's initial shock gave way to fear, and she stammered as she tried to answer, realizing that the young man she had welcomed into her home now posed a genuine threat. Without warning, James's demeanor shifted from detached to aggressive. He moved closer, his gaze intense, and demanded that she show him where she kept her cash. Eleanor, paralyzed by fear, hesitated, trying to reason with him, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. Under duress, Eleanor led James to her bedroom, where she kept a small safe hidden in the closet. Her hands trembled as she opened it, revealing the cash she had withdrawn over the years, her savings from a life carefully guarded and controlled. She felt exposed and humiliated as James grabbed the money without hesitation, pocketing it with a cold efficiency that left her shaken. But as she watched him, a desperate resolve stirred within her. She tried to reason with him, begging him to leave and forget what had happened, to take the money and go. Yet her pleas only seemed to agitate him further. Eleanor's fear transformed into a survival instinct, her mind racing for a way to escape. She pushed him away with her hands and tried to run out of the room. James was faster. In a sudden, brutal motion, he grabbed her by the hair, and then grabbed her neck from behind with both hands and began to strangle her. She struggled, fighting to break free, but his strength and determination overwhelmed her. When the violence ended, the once warm and inviting home was filled with a chilling silence. Eleanor's lifeless body lay sprawled in her own bedroom, surrounded by the remnants of a life she had built and then tragically lost. James took a moment to compose himself, glancing around the room to ensure he had left no trace of his presence. Satisfied, he quickly gathered the cash and a few pieces of jewelry, slipping them into his pockets before making his way out of the house. The following morning, Eleanor's quiet neighborhood was rattled by the shocking discovery of her body. A close friend, alarmed by Eleanor's uncharacteristic silence, had come by to check on her after receiving no response to texts and calls. Upon entering the home and discovering Eleanor's lifeless form in her bedroom, the friend immediately called the police. Soon, a team of investigators arrived, transforming the once peaceful home into a bustling crime scene, marked by yellow tape, flashing lights, and uniformed officers moving with grim determination. The investigators began their work systematically, starting with a detailed assessment of the scene. From the beginning, the circumstances suggested a crime of both passion and opportunity. Eleanor's body bore signs of struggle, indicating that the encounter had not been planned as a simple robbery. Her disheveled bedroom and the open safe revealed that her killer had taken valuables, cash, jewelry, and possibly more. The methodical stripping of valuable items suggested premeditation, yet the violence hinted at something personal, a flare of emotion that went beyond cold calculation. As detectives scoured the house, they pieced together fragments of Eleanor's life. The first lead in the investigation came from Eleanor's browsing history and social media accounts. While outwardly conservative, her computer revealed accounts on dating and escort websites, an aspect of her life no one had anticipated. Eleanor's messages revealed conversations with a range of younger men, each interaction marked by an exchange of affection and, more tellingly, financial incentives. It was clear that she had been involved in a series of clandestine relationships, each one discreetly organized and financially arranged. Investigators suspected that her killer was someone she had met in this hidden world, likely drawn to her wealth and willing to exploit her vulnerability. Realizing the sensitive nature of these findings, detectives proceeded with caution. They knew this information could easily skew public perception of the victim, yet it was essential to understand her relationships to find her killer. Carefully, they began sifting through recent contacts, looking for any conversations or arrangements that might point to a suspect. Their attention was soon drawn to the most recent exchanges with a young man named James, a 20-year-old who had shown an unusual level of interest in Eleanor's life. James's profile stood out immediately. Unlike her other contacts, his exchanges with Eleanor revealed a gradual escalation in intensity and personal inquiry. He had seemed charming and attentive at first, but his tone grew more probing as their conversations progressed. Detectives noted a subtle shift in his messages, hinting at curiosity about Eleanor's wealth and lifestyle, which eventually became a fixation on visiting her home. His final messages before the night of her death had been brief and direct, suggesting a lack of warmth that contrasted sharply with earlier exchanges. Using this digital trail, detectives tracked down James's identity and learned more about his background. He had no prior criminal record, but his social media presence revealed a lifestyle marked by financial struggles, sporadic employment, and a circle of friends who shared his restless attitude toward money and security. It became clear that James had viewed Eleanor not as a person, but as an opportunity, a source of financial gain wrapped in the guise of an unconventional relationship. Detectives issued a warrant for James's arrest, knowing he would be a flight risk if he learned he was a suspect. They apprehended him within days, taking him into custody at a rundown apartment he shared with friends. In his possession, they found several pieces of Eleanor's jewelry, as well as a significant amount of cash. His belongings became crucial evidence, but investigators needed more to solidify their case. They needed a confession or proof that he had indeed been at her house the night she was killed. During the interrogation, James initially denied knowing Eleanor beyond a few harmless conversations. He claimed that their exchanges had been nothing more than idle flirting, denying that he had ever been to her house or taken anything from her. However, faced with the undeniable evidence, Eleanor's jewelry in his possession and incriminating messages on his phone, his story quickly unraveled. Under pressure, he admitted to visiting her home but claimed that he had only intended to borrow some cash. When questioned further, James's arrogance began to fade, replaced by a visible anxiety as detectives closed in on the specifics of his actions. They presented forensic evidence from the crime scene, including a partial fingerprint on the open safe and faint traces of his shoe prints leading through her living room. He had left behind more traces than he'd realized, each one a testament to his inexperience and lack of planning. Slowly, the enormity of his actions began to dawn on him. As the investigation wrapped up, detectives pieced together a coherent timeline of the crime. They believed that James had entered Eleanor's home under the pretense of a date, likely planning to steal from her and escape without confrontation. However, at some point during the encounter, a struggle had ensued. Perhaps Eleanor had discovered his intentions, or perhaps he had lost control in the face of her vulnerability. The ensuing violence was both senseless and brutal, driven by James's perception of her as an easy target. The case received widespread media coverage, casting Eleanor's hidden life into public scrutiny and eliciting a range of reactions. With James's trial looming, the prosecutors prepared to present the evidence of his guilt, seeking justice for Eleanor and closure for her grieving friends and family. In the months following Eleanor's death, her once hidden life became the focus of intense media scrutiny. Local papers detailed her relationships with young men found online, weaving a narrative that shocked her friends and family, who had always seen her as a reserved, intelligent, and successful woman. As more facts emerged, her story was sensationalized, a tragic tale of a lonely woman seeking connection in secret, leading to her own tragic end. Meanwhile, James faced an unrelenting judicial system. The evidence against him was damning: fingerprints, surveillance footage from the area, and a trail of messages connecting him to Eleanor. Prosecutors built a strong case, charging him with multiple offenses, including first-degree murder, aggravated robbery, and aggravated assault. Despite his defense's attempts to paint his actions as the result of a challenging life and his relationship with Eleanor as manipulative, the court found little sympathy for his crime. Ultimately, James was sentenced to 13 years in prison. For those who had known Eleanor, the aftermath was bittersweet. Her story, now known by many, served as a sobering reminder of how isolation and secrecy can sometimes lead to tragedy. Although Eleanor's legacy was tarnished by the circumstances of her death, her friends and family tried to honor her memory by focusing on the impact she'd had on those around her, hoping that, in the end, her life could be remembered for more than its tragic end.